October 12, 1944. Norfolk Naval Base. A group of German women prisoners stepped onto American soil, expecting weakness, poverty, and chaos. Instead, their eyes froze. Endless warships stretched across the horizon. The air shook with the roar of machines. Giant cranes moved like monsters, and factories poured out tanks and planes faster than they could count. One woman whispered, "It's not possible. This can't be real." They had been told America was soft. What they saw proved the exact opposite. And this shocking moment would change everything they believed about the war. Stay with us to see the full story. And if you love history told with truth and detail, please subscribe, like, and support the channel. Your support helps us bring more hidden stories like this to life. The morning of October 12, 1944 was crisp and sharp with the tang of salt carried in from the Atlantic. The SS Bremen eased into its berth at Norfolk, her steel hull streaked with rust from weeks at sea. On her deck, a group of 47 German women prisoners, captured across France, Belgium, and the crumbling Reich, clutched their thin coats tightly against the wind. They had been told by officers and Nazi propaganda alike that America was a land of soft comforts, incapable of true war-making. What they saw when the gangplank was lowered would begin to unravel that illusion at once. The dock was alive with sound. The metallic clang of hammers on hull plates rang like cathedral bells, steady and relentless. Diesel engines coughed black smoke as cranes lifted crates the size of cottages onto waiting railcars. The smell was overwhelming. Tar, grease, and hot steel mixed with brine. To German eyes accustomed to scarcity, it was an assault of abundance. One of the women, Ingrid, scribbled later in her diary, "We expected emptiness. Instead, we saw a harbour more crowded with ships than Hamburg in its prime." The paradox could not have been clearer. These prisoners, trained technicians and auxiliaries, had expected to find a hollow society. Instead, before they even touched American soil, the evidence of a war machine beyond their imagining surrounded them. The Norfolk Yard alone employed over 40,000 men and women, launching a Liberty ship every 4 days. By war's end, American shipyards would launch 2,710 of them. The scale dwarfed Germany's entire wartime production. A U.S. Navy lieutenant escorted them down the gangplank. His tone was formal but not hostile, a quiet civility that added to their unease. The women's boots clattered on the dock, and their eyes darted between lines of soldiers standing at ease and the endless background of cranes, cargo nets, and half-built vessels. The silence among the Germans was heavy, broken only by the shuffle of feet and the rhythmic slam of shipyard machinery. For the Americans, this was routine. For the prisoners, it was revelation. The very air seemed charged with movement and power. They noticed details, a convoy of trucks idling nearby, their tanks full, their tarpaulins new, pallets of fresh uniforms stacked waist-high. To a people who had been rationing soap and sugar since 1940, these were signs of unthinkable plenty. One prisoner whispered, "Das ist nicht möglich." It's not possible. Another clutched her scarf tighter, as though bracing against something more dangerous than the chill wind. What they saw was not staged. It was not a tour arranged to impress them. It was simply daily American life in wartime, and that fact unsettled them more than any propaganda film could have. A Red Cross observer, present to ensure the prisoners were treated humanely, noted in his report, "The women seemed disoriented, less by their capture than by their arrival. The docks themselves appear to have communicated a power greater than force of arms." As the Germans were guided toward waiting buses, they caught a final sight of the horizon, ship masts and smokestacks stabbing into the sky like a forest of iron. It was an image that none of them would forget. But this was only the beginning. Their journey inland would take them deeper into the industrial heart of the United States, past evidence even more staggering than the docks of Norfolk. And with every mile, the contradiction between what they had believed and what they now witnessed would grow sharper still. The convoy rolled out of Norfolk just after noon, escorted by a pair of military jeeps. The buses, painted olive drab, rattled along the coastal highway, their windows streaked with sea salt. Inside, the German women sat in tense silence, their eyes drawn irresistibly to the passing landscape. They had expected to find scarcity. Instead, mile after mile, America revealed itself as an arsenal without end. The first shock came only minutes after leaving the harbour. Shipyards stretched for blocks, smoke and steam rising from gantries as welders sent cascades of sparks into the grey air. Rows of Liberty ships stood in various stages of completion, some nothing more than ribs and plates, others nearly ready for launch. A young signals officer among the prisoners, who had studied naval tonnage tables, whispered in disbelief, 1 yard here, more hulls than in all of Kiel. The numbers bore her out. Norfolk alone produced dozens of destroyers, carriers and auxiliaries by 1944. Across the nation, U.S. yards were producing 18 million tons of shipping annually, 6 times Germany's entire wartime output. The rhythm of hammers and rivet guns echoed through the bus windows like an industrial heartbeat. As the convoy moved inland, the landscape changed from docks to factories. Smokestacks punctuated the horizon. Warehouses sprawled across acres, their walls stenciled with names the women only vaguely recognized from intercepted American documents. Ford, DuPont, Bethlehem Steel. One prisoner later recalled, "It was as if every town was a barracks, every street a supply line. We realized then our own newspapers had lied. This was no soft, distracted people. This was a nation at war." The paradox deepened with every mile. The roads themselves seemed part of the revelation. Highways carried streams of trucks loaded with crates, tanks and spare parts. Gasoline, so scarce in Germany that doctors biked to hospitals, flowed freely here, fueling a ceaseless motion of men and material. The women smelled it as the convoy slowed, sharp, sweet petrol fumes clinging to the warm autumn air. One of the drivers, Sergeant James Foster, chuckled when he overheard a prisoner gasp at the sight of hundreds of trucks lined nose to tail at a depot. "Lady," he muttered under his breath, "this ain't even half of what's on the road." For him it was mundane. For them, it was unthinkable. At a rest stop outside Newport News, the buses idled beside a rail yard. There, long lines of boxcars and flatbeds stood ready, each stamped with white chalk indicating destinations. Pittsburgh, Chicago, St. Louis. Cranes loaded crates marked with serial numbers, and the sheer orderliness of the operation left the women unsettled. In the Reich, chaos reigned. Bombing raids disrupted shipments, shortages forced improvisation. Here, the logistics were clean, efficient, relentless. The prisoners exchanged glances, silently taking stock. Several of them were trained analysts, their value to Berlin tied to their ability to read capacity from detail. What they saw, the frequency of trains, the volume of materials, the neat stockpiling of goods, suggested an enemy whose resources dwarfed their own. One scribbled into a notebook, later recovered. "We thought America was a land of consumers. It is instead a land of producers. Every factory we pass is another nail in our coffin." And yet, paradoxically, no one flaunted this abundance. American civilians along the route went about their lives, workers in coveralls, children playing by the roadside, women carrying groceries. There was no sense of strain or collapse, none of the hollow-eyed exhaustion that defined German cities in 1944. Instead, vitality seemed to spill from the very streets. The prisoners could not reconcile it. A nation that waged global war while still feeding its people, still clothing them well, still laying down highways and bridges as though peace had never left. By the time the convoy neared Richmond, the women were silent. The shock of the harbour had given way to a deeper, gnawing realization. What they had seen in a single afternoon surpassed what Germany could produce in a year. Their faith in propaganda, that America was soft, incapable, divided, was dissolving like frost under the Virginia sun. But their journey was not yet done. Ahead lay the camps themselves, processing centers where, paradoxically, their captors would treat them with a dignity and care they had not expected. And in that, a new revelation awaited. The buses turned off the main road at dusk, gravel crunching under the tires as they approached a sprawling compound ringed by barbed wire. The women braced themselves, expecting filth, overcrowding, and brutality. German propaganda had painted American prisoner of war camps as little more than cages. But as the gates swung open, another paradox revealed itself. The barracks that lay before them looked more like a college campus than a prison. Neat rows of wooden buildings stood in orderly lines, their roofs tarred against the weather. Smoke curled from chimneys, carrying the scent of warm bread from a nearby mess hall. Beyond the barracks stretched tidy gardens and a field marked for recreation. One woman, a nurse named Hildegard, muttered, "Impossible. They live better here than our own soldiers at the front." Inside the processing center, the shock deepened. Each prisoner was assigned a number, photographed, and issued fresh bedding. Then came the medical inspection. Dr. Elizabeth Crawford, a Navy physician, conducted examinations with brisk professionalism. She checked teeth, listened to lungs, and noted malnutrition in nearly every case. "You've been living on 1,200 calories a day, maybe less," she told one interpreter. "Our men get twice that, even in the field." For the Germans, the contrast was humiliating. Back home, rations had dwindled to thin slices of black bread, ersatz coffee, and watery stews. Here, even prisoners were measured for proper shoes and vaccinated against disease. Ingrid later wrote in her journal, "They treat us like patients, not enemies. It is an insult and a mercy both." The paradox did not end with food or medicine. That evening, the women were led to their barracks, where clean cots with wool blankets awaited them. Soap and towels were stacked in neat piles by the washroom. A Red Cross representative explained that under the Geneva Convention, prisoners were entitled to basic dignity. The Germans stared in disbelief. Their own government had signed those conventions, yet Soviet and French prisoners in the Reich starved in open fields. Numbers tell the story starkly. In American camps, German POWs received an average of 3,500 calories daily, more than many US civilians during rationing. In German camps, Allied prisoners often starved on fewer than 1,000. One prisoner confessed in a hushed tone, "If Berlin knew the truth, they would never forgive us for surviving so well." The sensory details etched themselves into memory. The smell of clean sheets, the taste of white bread and butter at supper, the clatter of stainless cutlery, all symbols of plenty. In one corner, a prisoner broke down in tears after biting into an orange, a fruit she had not seen since before the war. "To us," she whispered, "this was luxury beyond reason." Yet the treatment was not indulgence, it was discipline. Guards maintained order firmly, and escape was not tolerated. But the civility itself was its own weapon, a subtle demonstration of American confidence. As one US officer remarked, "We can afford to treat them well, we are not afraid of them." The women lay awake that first night, listening to the low hum of a generator and the distant bark of guard dog. For some, it was the first uninterrupted night of rest in months. For others, it was torment. To be shown humanity by the enemy made the Reich's brutality harder to justify. But what they had seen so far, the harbor, the highways, the barracks, was only the surface of America's power. Soon, they would hear voices crackling across open radios and telephone lines, revealing something even more disorienting. A war effort coordinated with a reach that defied imagination. The morning routine began with roll call, the bugle sharp against the autumn air. After breakfast, eggs, toast and hot coffee that tasted like luxury itself, the prisoners were escorted into a common hall. There, for the first time, they heard something they had been told could not exist, the open pulse of American communications. Radios hummed, telephones rang, and the steady clatter of typewriters filled the air. For women trained in signal work, radar and logistics, the soundscape itself was a revelation. They leaned forward, ears sharpened. Through the static of a shortwave set came voices speaking in clipped English, weather updates from Kansas, shipping manifests from New Orleans, naval traffic off the Pacific coast. The astonishing part was not just the breadth of information, it was how unguarded it seemed. One of the Germans, a former radio operator named Lotte, whispered, "They don't even bother to hide it. They broadcast to the world because they can afford to." In the Reich, secrecy was everything. Lines were tapped, codes were cloaked, paranoia governed every transmission. Here, the openness was both confusing and terrifying. A US Army sergeant noticed the women's rapt attention and explained casually, "This is just routine. We've got thousands of stations, thousands of lines. Every state, every base, every ship. We're all connected." He shrugged as though describing nothing remarkable. But for the prisoners, it was staggering. Germany's fragmented networks, crippled by bombing and constant shortages, could barely maintain communication across its shrinking MP. Error and statistics confirmed what the women were realizing in real time. By 1944, the United States operated over 400,000 telephones in military service alone, with civilian lines numbering in the tens of millions. In contrast, the Reich had fewer than 2 million functioning lines, many concentrated in cities already reduced to rubble. The prisoners were allowed to send letters home under Red Cross supervision. Some even dictated messages to clerks who typed them on clean stationery. Ingrid recorded later, "To touch a telephone, to see a letter carried freely, was to feel civilization again. And yet, this freedom was what we were taught to despise." The paradox was sharp. Their captors' generosity highlighted the bankruptcy of their own regime's promises. The sensory experience reinforced the lesson. The steady buzz of switchboards, the metallic snap of plugs inserted, the constant whir of paper-fed teletype machines. It was a symphony of efficiency. The women realized that this invisible infrastructure was as decisive a weapon as tanks or planes. Wars were not only fought with rifle, they were won with coordination. Hildegard, the nurse, later confessed in a post-war interview, "I had believed America was disorganized, lazy, without discipline. Instead, I saw that even their voices had order. The war lived in every telephone line, every radio wave. It was inescapable." But the Americans were not showing off. To them, this was routine administration. The very normalcy of it rattled the prisoners most of all. If this was the background noise of a single camp in Virginia, what must the full network of the United States sound like? That evening, as the women returned to their barracks, the paradox weighed heavily. They had been captured soldiers, expecting humiliation. Instead, they were being given glimpses of a system so vast it seemed casual in its power. For the WWII, secrecy was armor. For America, transparency was strength. And soon, the proof of that strength would become even more visible. Their next journey would take them into the hangars, where the scale of American air power, measured not in whispers and signals but in steel wings and roaring engines, would shatter their illusions further still. The first thing they noticed was the smell, thick with oil, rubber and gasoline, a scent so strong it clung to their clothes long after they left. The convoy of buses pulled up beside an enormous corrugated hangar, its doors yawning open like the mouth of some colossal beast. Inside, wings gleamed under overhead lamps, engines hung from cranes, and teams of mechanics swarmed over fuselages with a precision that looked almost rehearsed. For the German women, most of them raised on tales of Luftwaffe superiority, the sight was a shock. In their minds, German aircraft, Messerschmitts, Junkers, Focke-Wulfs, were still unmatched. Yet here stood rows of American bombers and fighters, not hidden away in precious secrecy, but out in the open by the dozens, perhaps the hundreds. A sergeant named Michael O'Brien, tasked with escorting the prisoners, walked them down the hangar floor. He was a cheerful Irish-American with grease on his sleeves and no sense that he was revealing anything remarkable. "This one here," he said, slapping the flank of a B-24 Liberator, "can be replaced in 3 days if it's lost. 3 days, ladies, that's how fast we turn 'em out." The words landed heavier than any bomb. 3 days. In Germany, aircraft factories were shattered by Allied raids. Spare parts were scarce. Engines often took weeks to assemble. Some planes were cannibalized just to keep others flying. Here, the idea that a lost bomber was simply a line item to be filled staggered them. Numbers backed up O'Brien's boast. In 1944 alone, the United States produced 96,000 aircraft, more than Germany built in the entire war. At its peak, a new plane rolled off American assembly lines every 5 minutes. The contrast was obscene in its scale. The sensory details made the revelation undeniable. The rhythmic pounding of rivet guns echoed through the hangar like machine gun fire, but instead of destruction, it created power. The air shimmered with heat from arc welders. Mechanics shouted to one another over the roar of test engines. The very floor vibrated with industry. One of the prisoners, Lotta the radio operator, muttered, "So many, and still more coming." Her voice trembled not from fear of the guards, but from the sheer realization of what she was seeing. Hildegard, the nurse, confessed in her journal, "Our leaders told us America was weak, unwilling to sacrifice." Yet here, sacrifice was invisible. It was production, not desperation. What struck them most was the casualness of it all. Workers joked, shared cigarettes, and wiped sweat from their brows, as though assembling aircraft was just another day's labor. To the Germans, who had been told every German worker was pressed to their absolute limit, this ease was unnerving. How could a people so relaxed produce such overwhelming force? O'Brien, noticing their awe, leaned closer and said with a grin, "You think this is big? You should see Detroit. This hangar is nothing but a drop in the bucket." He chuckled and walked away, leaving the women in silence. The paradox hung heavy in the air. For the Reich, every lost plane was a national tragedy. For America, it was an inconvenience remedied in days. That difference alone signaled the war's trajectory. As the women were led back out into the sunlight, the roar of an engine test firing shook the ground beneath their feet. The sound followed them onto the buses, rattling in their bones like a prophecy. But their education was not finished. In the weeks to come, they would be shown something even harder to deny. Photographs and reports of American bombing campaigns that proved this industrial power was not just theoretical. It was reaching deep into the Reich, with devastating precision. 3 weeks passed in the camp. A strange limbo of routine meals, medical checks, and carefully monitored recreation. By now, the German women no longer jumped at the sound of American trucks or the bark of orders in English. But the moment that altered their understanding most profoundly did not come from what they saw in person. It came from what they were shown on paper. One morning, they were gathered in a small hall where US intelligence officers spread photographs across long wooden tables. The pictures were black and white, crisp and devastating. They showed German cities from the air. Factories before and after raids, rail junctions in tatters, synthetic fuel plants cracked open like eggshells. "This," said one officer in a measured tone, tapping a photo of the lunar works near Mersburg, "produced most of Germany's aviation fuel, or rather, it used to." The image beside it showed twisted steel, shattered pipelines, and plumes of smoke frozen mid-rise. The women leaned over the photographs in silence. They had been told by Nazi broadcasts that Allied bombing was random, clumsy, and largely ineffective. Yet here was evidence of something precise, calculated, and relentless. One after another, the photos reinforced the point. A ball-bearing plant in Schweinfurt reduced to rubble. Bridges across the Rhine snapped like matchsticks. Rail yards in Cologne littered with craters. A prisoner named Marta whispered, almost to herself, "So that is why our trains never come." Statistics confirmed the pictures. By mid-1944, Allied bombers were dropping over 200,000 tons of explosives on Germany every month. Aircraft losses were high, but American production, those hangars of bombers they had already seen, made the losses sustainable. Germany, meanwhile, could not replace its fuel or machinery. Every blast photo laid bare the truth. The Reich was bleeding out under skies it could no longer control. The sensory impact was undeniable even in still images. The women studied the jagged white scars of bomb craters against blackened earth, the skeletal remains of factories once buzzing with life. One wrote in her diary later, "I could almost smell the smoke rising from the paper." What shook them most was the casualness with which the officers presented the images. This was not theatre for their benefit. It was routine analysis, something the Americans sifted through daily. To the prisoners, each photograph was a dagger. To the officers, it was just another report in a stack of thousands. One officer explained without malice, "We don't need to destroy everything. Just the fuel, the bearings, the bridges. When those are gone, your armies can't move." His words were clinical, but to the prisoners, they carried the weight of inevitability. Ingrid wrote afterward, "It was not hatred that defeated us. It was arithmetic." The paradox was stark. German propaganda painted America as reckless and chaotic, yet what the women saw was cold, disciplined precision. When the session ended, the women walked back to their barracks under a sky streaked with contrails. For the first time, they felt as though the very clouds belonged to the enemy. The Reich had told them the skies were theirs. The truth was written in smoke above their heads. But this new knowledge carried a moral dilemma. Should they keep silent, protecting the illusion their country still clung to? Or should they speak, risking accusations of betrayal? That question would come to a head with the arrival of a letter, one that would test both their loyalty and the Americans' willingness to expose the truth. The letter arrived on a grey afternoon, slipped under the door of the barracks like contraband. It bore no official stamp, only a faint pencil scrawl across the envelope. Hildegard, the nurse, picked it up first, turning it over in her hands. When she unfolded the paper, the women crowded around her like moths to a flame. It was from another German POW camp in the United States, smuggled through a network of prisoners who had found ways to communicate. The message was short. American guards began allowing more controlled visits into local towns. The contrast between propaganda and reality would deepen until denial was no longer possible. Spring 1945 brought with it a strange silence. The barracks that had once buzzed with rumor and disbelief grew quieter with each passing day. Newspapers, deliberately left in common rooms by American officers, announced the fall of one German city after another. Cologne, Dresden, Frankfurt. Each headline was a nail driven into the coffin of certainty. By April, whispers reached even the German women POWs. Hitler was dead. The Reich, which had claimed it would last 1,000 years, had collapsed in barely 12. The women sat on the wooden bunks, staring at one another, unable to reconcile the world they had been raised in with the world they now saw crumbling. Ingrid wrote in her diary, "We came here as soldiers of a nation that believed itself destined to rule Europe. Now I see only that we were children, fed stories, while America was building a world beyond our comprehension." The US Army began preparing the prisoners for repatriation. The women were issued clean uniforms, medical checkups, and rations for the voyage home. Some wept at the thought of seeing family again. Others feared what awaited them in a defeated, starving Germany. For all of them, the journey carried a haunting paradox. They were leaving behind comfort and order in the land of the enemy, returning to chaos in their homeland. Before departure, a Red Cross officer presented Ingrid with a decision. She could carry a message home, not a personal letter, but a report to German authorities. Washington had debated the risk. Would her words be dismissed as enemy propaganda, or could they serve as proof of the futility of resistance? Ingrid's account was brief but unflinching. America's strength is not a lie. It is everywhere. In their machines, their factories, their food, their unity. To continue this war is madness. When the ship carrying them docked in Bremerhaven, a report was sent up to the chain of command. The reaction was predictable. German officers dismissed it outright, labeling her either a traitor or a gullible woman seduced by American trickery. The truth was too large to fit into their shrinking ideology. But for the women themselves, the truth could not be erased. They had seen aircraft rolling off assembly lines faster than they could be destroyed, had eaten meals more abundant than their families could dream of, had walked streets where children written in hurried German script. Hold fast. The Reich is pushing back on all fronts. New weapons will change the war. Do not believe what the Americans show you. Victory is near. The words echoed the same promises they had heard before capture. Yet now, after the hangar and the photographs, the sentences rang hollow. The letter's tone of desperation was louder than its bravado. Lotta, the radio operator, shook her head. If we were winning, they would not need to write this. But Hildegard pressed the paper flat on the table, frowning. Still, it is what our families are being told back home. What if they believe it, while we know something else? The tension in the room thickened. Their lives in camp were already shaped by paradox. Treated better by their captors than by their own regime, fed regularly while their families starved, shown truths that contradicted the Reich's ironclad propaganda. Now, the letter threatened to drag them back into the shadows of belief. That evening, an American lieutenant, one of the officers who had shown them the bombing photos, addressed the women. He had the letter in his hand, clearly intercepted. You don't have to believe me, he said, his German halting but clear. But you should know this. We do not show you lies. We don't need to. He then laid a fresh set of photographs on the table. These were even more recent. Rail depots in Frankfurt Row. Reduced to rubble, columns of smoke from Hamburg that seemed to stretch into the sky forever. The contrast between the smuggled letter and the stark images could not have been sharper. For the first time, one of the prisoners, Greta, who had been silent for weeks, spoke firmly. If Germany has such weapons, why do they not stop this? She tapped the photo with a trembling finger. The silence that followed was heavier than any guard's command. That night, few of them slept. The sound of distant engines from a nearby training airfield rolled through the darkness like a reminder. Their dreams were filled with smoke, factories collapsing, and the nagging thought that perhaps loyalty had become nothing more than a habit of fear. The letter had intended to steal their faith. Instead, it cracked it further. The question of what to believe no longer had an easy answer, and in the weeks ahead, as played without fear of air raids, what they carried back was not just memory, but comparison, a living contradiction to everything the Reich had promised. Years later, some of them would tell their children and grandchildren about that surreal journey to America. They did not speak of humiliation, but of awakening. They recalled the clang of shipyard hammers, the endless rows of tanks, the freedom of speech they overheard in every cafe and street. These were impressions that no photograph or speech could erase. They had come as prisoners of a regime that called itself invincible. They left as witnesses to its delusion. And in the end, it was not America's bombs that most unsettled them. It was America's abundance, its relentless capacity to create, and its refusal to bow to scarcity. This wasn't propaganda. This was reality. They had come as conquerors. They left as students. In the final tally, America's greatest weapon was not its arsenal, but its proof that freedom, when matched with industry and will, could outbuild any tyranny.